Hi everyone. This is actually going to be the first lesson video for chapter 16, and I apologize ahead of time if I sound frustrated because this is now the second time that I filmed this video. First time 25 minutes long, and realized at the end of it all that actually my microphone was turned off. So it's a wonderful thing, but hey, we're all getting used to different things right now, so hopefully my mic is turned on this time. Gonna test it out afterwards, but in any case, this is chapter 16, lesson 1. Chapter 16 is titled Towards Civil War. Lesson 1, as it says here, titled The Search for Compromise. As I mentioned to you guys before we left school, that over the next couple social study sessions, we're going to be talking a little bit about the Civil War, the events leading up to it, the events that were actually part of the war itself, and everything that happened after the war, the period of time that we call today Reconstruction. So we're going to just get straight into it so we don't use up any time. Throughout the rest of this lecture, feel free to go ahead and take any screenshots, iPad pictures. Definitely encourage you to take notes as I go along. Since we're not copying from a Promethean board and we're just watching this video, I'm going to try to move very quickly, so you're more than welcome to pause the video at any given point in time. So without further ado, the search for compromise. In the history of the United States, the question of slavery had come up several times, each time fueling more and more debate. Each debate, however, led to some form of compromise. Now we look at this word, compromise. We've heard it before in social studies. We've probably used it before. When you think of a compromise in your terms, you probably just think of, you and your buddy, let's say, hungry for lunch or dinner. You can't decide where to eat. One of you wants a burger. One of you wants pizza. You try to reach some sort of compromise with each other. Maybe we're going to have a burger today and we're going to have a pizza, tomorrow and gain 10 pounds by the end of the week. Hopefully not. But we're talking about compromises from back in the day. Compromises were used to settle much bigger issues than just, hey, what do you want for lunch? One kind of compromise, definitely relevant to the issue of slavery, the issue of pre-Civil War period America, 1820, the Missouri Compromise. When this was passed, it created a balance between slave states and free states in the Senate. So, the Senate today as being one half of Congress, 2 senators per state. At the time, we did not have 50 states in America, but there was a balance between the power given to the slave states and the power given to the free states. If you know anything about power, it's that people are never happy with the amount that they have. So, new territories bringing new debates. 1844, new debates over slavery are going to rise. The United States is acquiring new territories at this time. So they're actually going ahead and are debating as to, okay, guys, how is slavery going to be tied into this time period, into all of these states. So at the time, the Democratic Party, different from the Democratic Party as we know it today, the Democratic Party went ahead and nominated James K. Polk out of the state of Tennessee as their candidate for president. Part of Polk's plan was the annexation, which means the acquisition or occupation of Texas. Polk is elected president, and immediately after that, Texas becomes part of the Union. If you've never heard of this word before, Union, that is what is considered the northern government during Civil War period. The South was called the Confederacy. Texas became part of the Union in 1845. So now Polk has one big enemy, and that enemy is Mexico. Texas joining the Union angers the Mexican government. Why? Because Texas was actually a huge part of Mexico at the time. Geographically, Texas is adjacent to Mexico. It is the bridge between Mexico, Central America, and North America. At the time, there was no existent boundary line between Texas and Mexico. So Mexico's angry. Polk, of course, hungry for more territories, is also going to go ahead and try to buy California and New Mexico, at the time both Mexican territories, from the Mexican government. But Mexico will prevail, and he's going to fail each time. But this is just going to be one part of a series of a bigger problem. Texas joining the Union, disputes over those boundary lines between Texas and Mexico, and Polk's failures in purchasing new territories are going to lead to the infamous Mexican-American War. Now you might be wondering, Texas, part of Mexico, and New Mexico and California, we now call them states in the United States. Yeah, geographically speaking, this is what the map of North America looked like at the time. United States, you can see, has a very weird, almost looks like a gun formation. All of this is considered United States. This is Texas, not yet an official part of the United States. And you can even see that the lines drawn around Texas are very different. It actually says here that this area, what is considered Texas, roughly covers current Texas, parts of New Mexico, Oklahoma, and even going all the way up to Colorado. Now, this other strange shape over here, you might be wondering, oh, hey, isn't that California? Well, not quite yet. This area roughly covers the current states of California, Nevada, Arizona, Utah, and parts of New Mexico and Colorado. So we're labeling this territory the territory ceded by Mexico in 1848. Ceded means given up. This red line right here is the famous 3630 line, 36 degrees 30 north latitude. Everything north of the 3630 is the area of land that was actually against slavery. Everything to the south of that line, they were pro-slavery. So going back to the PowerPoint, New Mexican-American War breaks out. Very short war. It's only about a year and 9 months, resolved by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. We're not going to talk too much about it, but you can look it up more in detail on the internet. Shortly after that war erupts, the Mexican-American War, Representative David Wilmot of Pennsylvania introduces the Wilmot Proviso. Now, this proposal suggests that slavery should be banned in any new lands that the United States might acquire from Mexico. The South is not going to like this idea very much. They're going to protest. Why? They want new lands to stay open to slavery. They want slavery to become institutionalized, especially in the South. So to challenge Wilmot's proposal, Senator John C. Calhoun out of South Carolina is going to suggest that neither Congress nor any territorial government could ban slavery or regulate it. Regulate means to control. I would take a screenshot if you haven't already. You've got your first vocabulary word right here. Regulate, which means to control. So neither bill passed. Both of them, however, caused huge debate. By the election of 1848, the United States had acquired both California and New Mexico from Mexico, but took no action on the question of slavery in those territories. The election of 1848, we had two political parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, not the Republicans. They're not created yet. The Whigs were a political party who nominated General Zachary Taylor at the time. The Democrats nominated Senator Lewis Cass out of Michigan. Both candidates ignored the issue of slavery, which angered several voters. A lot of voters are like, hey, slavery is a huge question right now. What are you doing running for president? Just ignoring this big question. So what happened was this. Oppositionists to slavery left their political parties, several people out of the Whigs, several people out of the Democrats. They ended up forming their own political party called the Free Soil Party. Its slogan was free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. The party went ahead and chose former President Martin Van Buren as its candidate. Eventually, the Free Soil Party will actually become just a small part of the very much larger Republican Party, and that was the birth of Republicans and Democrats as we know it today. Zachary Taylor, Whig at the time, ended up winning the election, became the 12th president of the United States. The Free Soil Party did, however, gain several seats in Congress, so they're going to start acquiring more power. A little bit of information about the Free Soil Party. It says here the Free Soil Party was a minor political party in the United States prior to the Civil War. The party opposed the extension of slavery into the newly acquired western territories of the United States. We already went over their slogan. The party's ideas were popular with small farmers, merchants, mill workers, and several others. The Republican Party, which also opposed slavery, absorbed the Free Soil Party in 1854. So, the Free Soil Party is starting to mobilize. They're growing in power. They are fueled off of the theory, the idea of abolitionism. Now, probably from Mrs. Cesarano's class, when you guys covered freedom walkers, you've probably heard the term abolitionist. Abolitionism is a theory, belief against the institution of slavery. Abolitionism revolves entirely around abolishing, going up against slavery. So the fact that the Free Soil Party, which is revolving around abolitionism, and that they're getting power is largely going to concern people in the South. Why? Because the South enjoys slavery, unfortunately. Southerners began to push for a national fugitive slave law. Fugitive meaning runaway. Another vocab term, take a screenshot. You got two on here. Fugitive runaway slave law, which would require that every state return runaway enslaved persons. By 1849, California applies to become a state, however, without slavery. If California became a free state, slave states would be outvoted in the Senate. Anti-slavery groups also wanted to ban slavery in Washington, D.C. Southerners began to consider a new option. Unhappy with the turnout of events that were taking place in the last several years, they began to talk about seceding from the Union. If you know anything about this term right here, secession, secede, means to officially leave. You know that this is actually how the Confederacy was formed and eventually how the Civil War actually began. So 1 year later, 1850, Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky suggests a brand new compromise. His compromise is broken up into 4 parts, which I've labeled A, B, C, and D here. Part 1 of his compromise said that California would in fact be a free state. However, on the other hand, he went ahead and said that other new territories would be given no limits on slavery. They'd be allowed to enforce slavery as much as they wanted to, or limit it as much as they wanted to. The slave trade, we're not talking about slavery here, we're talking about the slave trade, the exchange of enslaved persons. The slave trade would be illegal in Washington, D.C., capital at the time, capital today. And it would also call for a stronger national fugitive slave law. So you can see here a little bit of a balance between what the North wanted and what the South wanted. Of course, however, debate is going to ensue. Many supported it, many opposed it. President Taylor, who was president at the time, opposed it, but died unexpectedly. His vice president, Millard Fillmore, who favored the plan, then assumed the presidency, became the 13th president of the United States. Senator Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois solved the debate by dividing Clay's plan into different parts to be voted on separately, parts A, B, C, and D. Several Whigs went ahead and abstained, meaning did not vote on the parts that they opposed. So, as a result, the Compromise of 1850 was passed. This compromise was broken up into several parts, possibly the most infamous one being the Fugitive Slave Act. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was part of that compromise, and this act said infamously that anyone who held a fugitive slave, a runaway slave, could be fined or imprisoned. Some Northerners refused to obey this law, saying that it was actually immoral to go ahead and face a fine or imprisonment for returning a fugitive slave. In fact, famous abolitionist Henry David Thoreau, in his essay titled Civil Disobedience, went ahead and said that if the law requires you to be the agent, in other words, the cause of injustice to another, then I say break the law. Northern juries also refused to convict people accused of breaking this law, and others even gave money to buy freedom for enslaved persons. There were many people, North and South, that actually wanted to preserve these people's lives rather than continue to keep them enslaved. So together, free African Americans and whites in favor of anti-slavery went ahead and formed a network, another vocab term, network, interconnected system. They formed a network called the Underground Railroad, which was intended to help runaway slaves find their way to freedom. Now, if you're in 8th grade and you still think that the Underground Railroad was, in fact, a literal underground system, I strongly suggest re-education for you. The Underground Railroad was not an actual underground system. It was just a series of steps and places, different little lodges, intended to help runaway slaves escape from the South to freedom in the North. This is going to be very hard, though, when Democrat Franklin Pierce becomes president, 14th president, that is number 14. President of the United States in 1853, because his intention is to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act by all means necessary. So a little bit about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, not to be confused with the one passed in 1793. The one from 1850, the one we're talking about this lesson, is actually much harsher. It says this act established strict penalties for anyone who helped an enslaved person escape. It also named special commissioners who had the power to return enslaved people to their owners. The act was in effect until 1864, when Congress finally abolished it. You can see they placed a $150 reward. Of course, the changing of economy, $150 then, a lot more valuable then than it is now. $150 reward for each enslaved person that was returned to his or her slave owner. Now, a little bit about the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad was a secret network that helped enslaved Africans escape to northern states and to Canada. Between 1810 and 1850, an estimated 100,000 enslaved people moved north on the Underground Railroad. Some of them you've probably heard of before, some of them probably not. The Underground Railroad provided food, clothing, transportation, hiding places, lodges for the people that were escaping from slavery. The fugitives moved under cover of darkness, traveling between 10 and 20 miles a night, all by foot. They rested and ate in people's homes, barns, and businesses called stations and depots. Some of those participants, some of those fugitives in the Underground Railroad included John Fairfield, Levi Coffin, and of course, probably most infamously, Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman made numerous trips to the South and helped several enslaved people gain freedom. So, going to give you a chance to think about this question based off of what we've been talking about. Feel free to go back in the video to answer the question. I'm going to take a couple seconds of silence before we go on to the next slide. Comprehension check for section 1. Who formed the Free Soil Party and why? All right, time is up. Those who formed the Free Soil Party were anyone who was opposed to slavery, oppositionists to slavery. Why did they form it? Because their parties refused to even take a stand on slavery in the territories. So we're on to section 2 now, which is all about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Fast forward to 1854. Once again, we're talking about Senator Stephen A. Douglas. You might recognize him as being the same Douglas who went ahead and settled the Compromise of 1850. So Douglas is going to introduce a bill to settle the issue of slavery in newly acquired territories in the Midwest. The region west of Missouri and Iowa would become respectively known as the territories of Kansas and Nebraska. Both territories were north of the 3630 latitude line, which was the borderline that limited slavery. Before this law, you might say, north of the 3630, yeah, those states would have been free, giving the free states more votes in the Senate, which would have angered the South. Before we continue, I want to talk a little bit about Douglas now that we've talked about him twice, both in terms of the Compromise of 1850 and now settling slavery in the Midwest, just to give you a kind of idea of the kind of person that Douglas was. Here's a little bit of information about him. This is actually going to include an excerpt of one of his speeches. It says here, in 1854, Stephen Douglas introduced the Kansas-Nebraska bill to the Senate, which we're talking about now, reopening the slavery dispute. Douglas later gave his reasons for offering the bill. Some words that Douglas is about to use here may sound offensive, but they were appropriate at the time that he gave the speech. These are his words. The whole South are rallying to the support of the doctrine that if the people of a territory want slavery, they have a right to have it, and if they do not want it, that no power on earth can force it upon them. I hold that there is no principle on earth more sacred to all the friends of freedom than that which says that no institution, no law, no constitution should be forced on an unwilling people contrary to their wishes. And I assert that the Kansas and Nebraska bill contains that principle. I say to you that there is but one hope, one safety for this country, and that is to stand immovably by that principle which declares the right of each state and each territory to decide these questions for themselves. But the abolition party really think that under the Declaration of Independence, the Negro is equal to the white man, and that Negro equality is an inalienable right conferred by the Almighty, and hence that all human laws in violation of it are null and void. With such men it is no use for me to argue. I hold that the signers of the Declaration of Independence had no reference to Negroes at all when they declared all men to be created equal. They were speaking of white men. So, definitely sounds racist, and I'm going to go ahead and definitely say that it is racist, looking at it from a modern perspective. At the time, however, these were how people were talking. Those especially who supported slavery, these were the kinds of conversations that people were having, and these were the nature of the words that they would actually be using. So Douglas introduces a bill to settle the issue of slavery in the newly acquired territories in the Midwest. As we talked about, territories that were north of the 3630 would have limited slavery. This would have given the free states more power in the Senate, which would have angered the South. So in an effort to please both the North and the South, Douglas also proposed repealing the Missouri Compromise, which would then permit voters in each territory to vote individually on whether or not slavery would be allowed on their land. He called this proposal popular sovereignty. Those of you who remember civics very well might recognize this term, popular sovereignty, because it is one of the principles of the Constitution. Popular sovereignty, as a principle of the Constitution, means that the people are the source of all government power. Douglas's definition of popular sovereignty, on the other hand, refers to a particular method for deciding the question of slavery in a place. Northerners protested against the proposal, as it would allow slavery in areas that have been free for many years. Now, on the other hand, Southerners are going to support the bill. They're going to say, hey, Kansas is more than likely to be settled by slaveholders that are moving in from Missouri. These voters then would, of course, vote to keep slavery legal. With the bulk of the vote of the South as a region, and the support of Northern Democrats, and of course with President Pierce sitting in the Oval Office, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed in 1854. This is going to cause a lot of issues in Kansas. Supporters from both the North and the South rushed over to Kansas. Armed pro-slavery supporters crossed the border from Missouri into Kansas just to vote for the law. They didn't even live in Kansas. They crossed over just to vote in favor of the law. They became known as border ruffians. New definition. When the elections for the Kansas-Nebraska Act took place, there were only about 1,500 registered voters living in Kansas. But with the overwhelming number of border ruffians that were crossing over, 6,000 people, over 6,000 people, voted for the law. The pro-slavery group, of course, won by a landslide, and slavery became legal in Kansas. Kansas established laws to support slavery, of which opponents and abolitionists refused to accept. These opponents to slavery armed themselves, held their own elections, and adopted their own constitution in which slavery was banned. By 1856, Kansas had two rival governments, all within its own state. 4 months later, May of 1856, slavery supporters are going to attack the town of Lawrence, an anti-slavery stronghold. Anti-slavery forces, of course, retaliated. Famous abolitionist John Brown went ahead and led an attack that killed 5 slavery supporters, and this bloodshed is going to continue for 3 more months, all the way through October of 1856, when federal troops are finally going to arrive to stop the feud, to stop the disagreement between both halves of Kansas. Now, historically speaking, at the time, this is the first time that we see people within one state disputing amongst themselves. So this event's going to go down in history. Newspapers at the time actually called this event, and it is still known today, as Bleeding Kansas. At the time, this was a new thing, the whole idea of mortal violence, violence leading to death just over the disagreement of slavery. At the time, this was unique and limited just to the Kansas territory. But we know that it's not unique anymore, because this is actually going to become the first sign of what was to come, the American Civil War. Alright, that about wraps up Chapter 16, Lesson 1. I'm I'm going to go ahead and give you some comprehension questions now on the next slide, which I encourage you to answer independently. Feel free to watch this video again for the notes. And stay tuned on Classcraft for the quest that I'll be posting for social studies, which will include an area for you to go ahead and submit the answers to the comprehension questions. Please, I encourage you to keep your answers to the questions on your own. You'd actually be hindering your friends if you go ahead and just share your answers, because the only way you can get to the questions is if you watch this video in its entirety. So of course, at the end of the day, we want everyone to watch the video. All right, so here are those comprehension questions. Go ahead and answer these on a Word document. I'll be opening up the area on Classcraft for you to answer. Let me go ahead and explain now, so you guys will have to message me less with any questions about this. Let me go ahead and go over each question, what you need to do. Number 1 says, explain the significance of the following terms: fugitive and secede. Explain the significance. Does not just say to define them, so please do not just give me definitions. Go ahead and in your own words explain why these terms are significant to this lesson. Number 2, use the following terms in a short paragraph about Kansas in the 1850s: border ruffians and Civil War. So in one paragraph of about 3 to 5 sentences, go ahead and use both these terms in a short little description about what Kansas is like in the 1850s. You can get a lot of information about Kansas in like the last minute of this video. Number 3, how did the Compromise of 1850 address the question of slavery? Number 4, what was the Wilmot Proviso? Why was it so controversial? Number 5, how did Stephen Douglas help win approval of the Compromise of 1850? And number 6, what were some ways that Northerners defied the Fugitive Slave Act? Thank you so much again for watching. This has been Chapter 16, Lesson 1. Stay tuned for more announcements, more lecture videos from me, Mr. G. In the meantime, you guys cannot comment, but feel free to go ahead and slap that like button at the bottom of this video and hit subscribe. I already see I have 13 subscribers on my way to becoming YouTube famous. Guys, thank you so much for watching. Ask me any questions that you have on Classcraft. God bless you all. Have a great day. Bye-bye.